Let's just kind of pick up where we left off. If you all remember, obviously, we've kind of covered a lot over the last 200 years. Um, Again, this new religion, this monotheistic religion, develops in what is now the Arabian Peninsula, led by again this prophet Muhammad, and eventually, this religious movement turns into a political one, where you see the massive expansion of a new empire, which again we'll call Dar al-Islam, if you all remember, the House of Islam, that expands to, at its greatest extent, southern France, all the way to what is now northern India. And again, you originally have, after Muhammad's death, these deputies, these caliphs, being elected by the Arab leadership, by the elite of the Arab leadership, but eventually you have a rebellion, a fitna, where eventually a new dynasty led by the Umayyads is established for the next 200 years, and that's where we are now. Remember, the last time that we left off, you have an attempted second revolution led by a relative of Muhammad, Abdullah bin al-Zubayr, who again eventually fails in his rebellion. Eventually, he's captured and beheaded. But nonetheless, this begins this kind of establishes the origins of the Sunni and Shia split, which again, just for clarification's sake, the Sunni are those who originally are those who believe that the leadership of the caliph should be someone who has the consent of the governed. In other words, it has a majority consensus that yes, this person should be the ruler. But then you also have the Shia who believe that the caliph should be at least a blood relative of Muhammad, which al-Zubayr was. But nevertheless, so going off to its height here now. Again, as I mentioned earlier, when the Arabs kind of explode out of the Arabian Peninsula and overwhelm the Sassanids, the Eastern Roman Empire itself suffers losses. Remember, Egypt and Syria are obviously an example of this, but then you eventually have, but for the most part, the Eastern Roman Empire continues to at least somewhat survive. Now, a lot of this it's not to say that there wasn't on the brink of destruction. As a matter of fact, the Arab armies had marched onto the capital of Constantinople several times, but these attacks had all failed. Now, I want to point out a couple of the two in particular, actually one in particular, that came the closest at the time. An Arab army marched into Constantinople. Now, remember, the city of Constantinople itself is surrounded by water. It's kind of built on a peninsula. If you remember, peninsula is just kind of a piece of land that sticks out into the ocean, or the sea in this case. And it's surrounded by water on all three sides, which makes it very defensible. And even then, the city itself is surrounded by pretty thick and massive walls. So the Arabs decide that the only way that they can actually effectively attack the city is by the sea. So they build a fleet and send it against Constantinople. Now, what saved the city eventually is the use of a secret weapon known as Greek fire. Now, I'll ask the class this: has anyone ever heard of Greek fire before? Okay, so does anyone know or have heard of napalm? There's a similar compound. So napalm, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a type of gelatin that ignites, and it burns at a very, very high rate. And again, it's still used in combat to this day. Now, Greek fire is somewhat similar to that, but believe it or not, it actually is effective, according to the primary sources that we've had. So what happens, or how Greek fire is used, is that the Roman ships would be loaded with this stuff and would shoot it out almost like through a fire hose. And at the end of this fire hose is like kind of like a primer, like a light, like a flame. And so when it shoots out, that flame ignites the Greek fire, and pretty much, that liquid, kind of like a jelly type of jelly type of substance, sticks on anything, skin, wood, the sails of the ships. And so basically, you're you're engulfed in this flame that never dies out, or at least it takes a long time to die out. Now, according to the sources, and these are the Arab sources themselves. Okay, so for this is kind of first-hand witness account. These Arab sailors who were kind of drowned and who were kind of drenched in this stuff would obviously the visceral reaction is to throw yourself into the water. But according to the sources, whatever this substance was, it kept on igniting even in the water. Okay, so it's not one of those, it's not like a flame where you put it in water and it extinguishes it. This continued to burn even in water. Now, I mentioned this in past tense because we don't know really how it's made. The recipe for Greek fire itself was kind of a state secret. It was passed from emperor to emperor throughout Greek history, and it would never. And when the last Byzantine emperor died in 1453, the secret never got out, and so to this day we don't know how it's made. Now, I will say this is that if you go online, you can actually find supposed recipes on how to make Greek fire. Please, please, please do not try this at home. I can't believe I even have to say that, but again, people get bored at home and they try it. Again, please don't try it at home. First of all, again, literally no one knows how it works. And second of all, even if you figure it out, you're not going to find the easy way. You know what I mean? So again, just leave it in the history books. Again, I already said my liability part, so if you want to go ahead and try it, you can't sue me. Now, so if you all remember, again, despite the fact that the Umayyads are, needless to say, kind of the undisputed rulers of Dar al-Islam, it's not to say that they're not without their challenges. Again, remember, one of the big challenges is the frustration of the newly integrated Persians. Remember, the Persians had felt that the Arabs were kind of pushing them out of political positions, and the Persians felt that if anyone is qualified to kind of lead a political position, it should be them. Now, eventually, another relative of Muhammad by the name of As-Saffah begins formulating a conspiracy, and he kind of forms this alliance of disgruntled Arab leadership, Persians, and a couple of other people, and pretty much promises them reform if they follow him into another fitna. Right? And eventually, a rebellion breaks out. The Umayyads are caught completely by surprise, and As-Saffah decides to kind of extend an olive branch and say, hey, maybe we can work this out. He sends out an invitation to the Umayyads to kind of have a sit down and kind of work out their differences, and the entire Umayyad family, shows up in the kind of this area outside of what is now Iraq. And it becomes a massacre. All right, this was a trap, and the As-Saffah and his followers pretty much just slaughter the entire Umayyad family, with the exception of one person. And so, with the Umayyads wiped out, As-Saffah puts himself on the throne of Caliph and establishes a new dynasty known as the Abbasid dynasty. Again, this is the new dynasty of, it very much is, Jonathan, where you pretty much have this entire family being wiped out and a new dynasty established known as the Abbasids. Now, we'll talk more about the Abbasids as we go along, but again, at this point in time, the Umayyad Caliphate is no more, and you have a new dynasty ruling Dar al-Islam. Now, let us turn to the East Roman Empire. Now, from this point in time, I'm going to just strictly refer to them as the Byzantine Empire. Again, remember, keep in mind that the words East Roman Empire / Byzantine are more or less the same, but some historians, and I'm more of this opinion, some historians use the terms Eastern Roman Empire and Byzantine Empire to differentiate a time period. We use the East Roman Empire name from the time that the Roman Empire, again, obviously from the time that the Roman Empire split into East and West, until the time that the Arabs began launching attacks on Constantinople. All right, so we use that to distinguish kind of eras within Byzantine history. So again, I'll start exclusively using the word Byzantium or Byzantine Empire. Again, Byzantium, Byzantine Empire, same thing. Now, So, um, needless to say, the the Byzantine Empire at this point in time, at the time of the kind of this Islamic resurgence, is in a very tough spot, because not only do you have to deal with, again, this new caliphate that seems overwhelming, you also have to deal with other pastoral or nomadic groups that have moved into Byzantine territory. An example of this are the Slavs and the Bulgars. Now, the Slavs are originally from what we now call Central Russia, and they're, again, what we refer to as an ethno-linguistic group. I think I mentioned them already in class before, but again, remember, the term Slavic refers to a family of languages: Russian, Polish, Serbian, Ukrainian, Moldavian, things like languages like that. All right, and so these Slavic-speaking peoples around, let's say, 800 CE, begin to migrate out of their traditional homeland and move into what is now Eastern and Southeastern Europe. And again, needless to say, this comes into conflict with the Byzantine Empire. In addition, you also have another group of pastoralists from central and southern Russia, the Bulgars, right, who eventually move into southern southeastern Europe and become bitter rivals of the Byzantine Empire. All right, so needless to say, you have quite a challenge in the chaotic period during this this period in time. Now, for many reformers within the Byzantine Empire, many of them saw this as an opportunity. In other words, many argue that the empire, before the rise of the caliphate and the arrival of the Slavs and the Bulgars, the empire was simply just too large to administer properly. And so, with the the supposed fat kind of trimmed, they saw the ability to kind of reorganize the empire into a leaner, more efficient system. And part of these reforms, designed to, again, respond to the needs of the empire at the time, there's a system known as the theme system. Now, this is how the theme system works. First of all, we have to understand that the Byzantine military is based on an entirely voluntary service system. In other words, just like here in the United States today, every single member of the Byzantine military is actually volunteer. And so, in order to maintain recruitment levels, they pretty much offer a retirement system. And how this works is that upon serving X amount of years, now it kind of varies over time, but let's say the average is 10. Upon serving 10 years, you pretty much enter into a retirement system. Now, your retirement system is basically land that you own, and land that becomes yours upon your retirement from the military. And so, the Byzantine Empire becomes divided into territories known as themes. So if you notice on this map here, there are various themes. These themes are the provinces and states of the Byzantine Empire. And each of these themes has a designated governor, who's also a general. So they have two main responsibilities. One is to defend, in case of an attack by Arabs or any other invader, and the other one is to ensure that land is distributed to these retirees. Okay, now, how this land is acquired is much like what's going on in China, where you pretty much have land being taken from nobles who, quite frankly, have too much. All right, so eventually, land is seized from them, from the nobility and from the landed elite, and given to veterans. Right? And so this is how this theme system works, and it's very effective. All right, the theme system increases in recruitment, and it increases the number of farmers, and it limits income inequality. All right, so overall, at least for your first few centuries, the theme system actually was very effective. All right, and it did allow the empire to not only thrive economically, but survive the various invasions of these different types of peoples. Now, needless to say, the Byzantine Empire is devoutly Christian. Now, I will say that you begin to see differences of Christianity between the Christianity based in Constantinople and the Christianity based in Rome. But we'll talk more about those differences in just a bit. Nevertheless, an example of the differences is the issue of the use of icons. Now, does anyone know what an icon is? And again, we're dealing with religious figures here, so obviously we're not referring to icons on a computer screen. Does anyone know what a religious icon is? They're not necessarily saints or, obviously we use the word icon today to refer to someone who is a famous or who has notoriety. But in religious studies, Kimberly, yes, it's basically a symbol. So it could be as simple as a cross, it could be a portrait, it could be a sculpture, something religious. For example, you could have things such as like a statue of the Virgin Mary with the child Christ, or things like that. Now, um, ever since the origins of Christianity, there's been a debate about the use of these things. Now, I'm just kind of wondering and see if anyone knows here, if can anyone answer, why would the use of these things, such as, for example, the use of a rosary or even the maintaining of a portrait of, of, of the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus, why would these be so controversial? Anyone? Um, so all three of you are somewhere right in a sense. Very good. So remember, one of the very first commandments that Moses passes on to the Hebrews is that of excuse me, graven images. Now, what these are essentially those, like, again, the things like statues, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's a very famous instance in the Old Testament when Moses, again, finds his upon freeing the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt. They build this bull and start thanking it. And needless to say, this is a huge no-no. Now, there are attempts to kind of differentiate between graven images, those you worship as symbolic and symbolic concepts, and things that you help to worship. In other words, the argument for rosaries is that you're not necessarily worshiping the rosary, but it's helping you concentrate. It is helping you focus your devotion and your meditation on these things. But nevertheless, it's a big, still at this point in time, a big controversy. Now, in the Latin version of Christianity, which again we'll differentiate between the Latin. Again, just make this differentiation at this point in time. Now, technically this is still the same religion. In other words, Christianity is, for the most part, at least in Europe, is still whole. But you begin to see two different interpretations of it. The Latin interpretation of Christianity, which later would become Catholicism, based in Rome, and the Greek interpretation of Christianity, which is based in Constantinople. Now, we'll eventually be coming, but we'll talk about it in just a minute, Aaron. So in Greek Christianity, again, you begin to see waves of this issue of icons and their use. Now, if you remember, when we're talking about early Christians in the Roman Empire, you essentially have things like, for example, Christians being persecuted during times of economic or political strife. When things weren't going well, when food wasn't on the table, when wars were being lost. The Roman Empire was always looking for someone to blame, and of course, Christians, those peace-loving weirdos, they're a perfect scapegoat. And so that's when you have Christians being persecuted and thrown into lion pits, et cetera, et cetera. But what do you do when you yourself are Christian and you have no one to persecute? And needless to say, a perfect scapegoat in this case was the icons. And so during times of civil strife, during times of crisis, you see mobs of people roaming the streets of the cities of the Byzantine Empire, breaking into houses and basically taking any form of icons. Could be crosses, could be portraits, could be sculptures, and destroying them. This process of destroying these icons is known as iconoclasm. right? So again, this is usually during times of religious strife or religious or a social or political strife. Now, and so again, this will be a fairly, an occasional a form of what we call catharsis. In other words, people, at the end of the day, people, who do this mob justice, whether it's persecuting Christians or persecuting those who have icons, or later on even persecution of Jews, Muslims, etc., etc. This is a form of what we call catharsis. Catharsis is this kind of general sense of good feeling that comes from actions, and in this case, this is an example of that. Now, um, after the after the destruction of the Umayyad Caliphate and the establishment of the Abbasids, you begin to see the Dar al-Islam somewhat destabilize. In other words, internal conflicts with one another, and you begin to see other issues forming. This opens the door for the Byzantines to kind of take control of some territory. So you begin, and even then, this is combined with a period of time known as the Macedonian dynasty, where you have a particular dynasty of Byzantine emperors. Now, I will use the term from this point on, the term of Belisarius. And Belisarius is the literal term of this is what the emperors call themselves, and this is what people call the emperor, Belisarius. It's the Greek term for king or ruler. Now, again, it's important to note that kind of at the underwhelming, or kind of at the bottom line of all this that I'm trying to get at, is that the Byzantine Empire itself, yes, it considers itself to be the successor of the Romans, but it is becoming more and more Greek. The main language is Greek. The main the religion itself is focused on Greek interpretations of Christianity. So while this is the Roman Empire, legally speaking, it is culturally Greek. Now, the Belisarius is during this period in time known as the Macedonian dynasty are effective. They're good rulers, and you begin to see them expanding the empire little by little. Now, an example of this is the issue, or at least one of the more prevalent and better known of these Macedonian emperors, that of Basil the Bulgar Slayer, which I always thought was the coolest name ever. Now, just to give an idea of kind of why he's called this. Now, I'm sure you can take a guess as to why he is called the Bulgar Slayer, but so there's one particular battle in which Byzantines. No, I mean the Cyrillic alphabet. Actually, you know what? Yeah, actually, Aaron, you're actually right, and I'll actually explain this in just a minute. Very good. So the Basil the Bulgar Slayer, he leads an army against the Bulgars, and eventually wins a massive battle in which not only does he defeat the Bulgar army, he actually captures about 30,000 of them. And so he has 30,000 prisoners. Now, usually Basil simply kills any prisoners he can find, hence the name the Bulgar Slayer. But he decides, since at the time it was around Easter, he decides to be generous and let them live, but with a simple kind of condition, in which he decides to blind all 30,000 of them. In other words, all 30,000 have their eyes taken out. Now, there is an exception. He lets 10 have one. He lets 10 of these prisoners keep an eye. Oh, but they lose a tongue for some reason. Oh, and they slice off their nose. But these 10 are responsible for leading the rest of the 30,000 back home, right? Pretty much showing the other Bulgars, this is what happens if you keep on messing with me. So, yeah. Eventually, Basil the Bulgar Slayer and his successors will eventually conquer the Bulgar Empire and eventually convert them to Christianity. And this kind of leads into what Aaron was pointing out here. Now, if you notice, the Greek and even to this day, the Russian alphabet is very different from ours. And this is so Christian missionaries began preaching to the Slavic peoples and began converting them. But the Christian missionaries began to realize that the Slavic languages don't really you can't really use the traditional Latin alphabet that again we're familiar with. And so you begin to see alterations being made to the alphabet to kind of lend itself to the Slavic languages. And this is where this new alphabet known as Cyrillic came into play. The Cyrillic alphabet is named after the supposed inventor, which is Saint Cyril. He and his brother came up with his alphabet again, for the purpose of converting the Slavic peoples to Christianity. It's a very good observation, Aaron. Now, so again, you begin to see, not only do you have the defeat of the Bulgars, but you also have expansion into previously held territory. And so things are relatively stable at this period of time. Not only that, you begin to see, again, this conversion effort by the Greeks, by these missionaries, succeed. An example of this is in the far north in Kievan Rus. Now, this is the area that we now call today Russia. And so let me briefly kind of discuss what happens during this period in time, or what this actually means. So the area of Russia, first of all, today does, or at least at the time, does not technically exist. It's a land of different nomadic peoples and tribes, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the originators of civilization at this period in time are actually the Vikings, the so-called Vikings, the Scandinavian individuals who begin migrating away from their traditional homeland of Sweden, what is now Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and begin. But again, it's important to note that the Vikings are more than just bloodthirsty warriors. They're merchants. That's the most important thing, and that's kind of the biggest contribution to this narrative, is that they are merchants, they're businessmen. And so they begin establishing trading networks throughout not just Western Europe, but they can begin establishing trading posts and other settlements in what is now modern day Russia. And in order to do business with things like the Byzantine Empire, and even just to give you an example, there's a particular tomb of a Viking king. And in this tomb, we found a 8-foot statue of a golden Buddha, all right, that we believe was originally carved or done in China. So the fact that you have an 8-foot golden Buddha in the tomb of a Viking in what is now Sweden goes to show you just how connected they were. Now, some of these forts and trading posts and settlements that the Vikings created in Russia, you begin to see people move into them, and eventually they become towns, and eventually become cities, which eventually become city-states, right? Now, eventually, the largest of these Russian, what we call Rus city-states, is Kiev, in what is now modern-day Ukraine. So Kiev becomes the most prosperous and largest of them. And its ruler, Vladimir, who at the time takes the title of prince, he decides he wants to convert to a major religion. Now, this is kind of an apocryphal story, but still there is some truth to this. So I'm going to tell you what the story is because I find it funny. So again, in order to kind of gain respect and be considered a serious ruler, he pretty much decides he wants to convert to a major universal religion. So he invites missionaries and other individuals to come and basically pitch him their religion. And so, excuse me. And so he, so eventually, and it kind of sounds like a bad joke, but bear with me. And so he invites a Jewish missionary, a Latin missionary, a Greek missionary, and a Muslim missionary, and they basically pitch him the religion. Now, the first one to go, or the first one to kind of give this pitch, is the Jewish missionary. And so he, the Jewish missionary gives this pitch, and he's somewhat impressed, that this religion has survived so long, but also at the same time cannot respect a religion that has no homeland. Remember, many, if not most Jews at this point in time, because of what happened during the Roman Empire, do not live in the traditional homeland of Israel. And so the fact that they lost their homeland, he doesn't really respect. And not only that, he's not really into the whole no eating pork or circumcision thing. So goodbye. Now, next is the Islamic missionary. And again, Islam at this point in time, very powerful, very influential religion. And Vladimir respects it a lot, but there is one big kicker. Yes, not only can you not eat pork, but you cannot drink alcohol. And he tells this missionary, drinking is the joy of the ruse. So thank you, but goodbye. And so then you have the Latin missionary, which again, he really likes Christianity. He was leaning towards it, but at the same time, the Latin missionary emphasizes that you take your orders from the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, which is at the point, 1,500 miles away. So he doesn't understand why he has to pay loyalty to a ruler 1,500 miles away, who he has no idea who it is. And so he sends the Latin missionary on his way. And so the Greek missionary eventually kind of gives a pitch, and he already has this fascination with Constantinople and the rulers. So he eventually converts to Greek Christianity, right? And so this begins the foundation of Russia's tie to what will later become Greek Orthodoxy. All right, so any questions at this point in time? Okay. So as a sign of loyalty, as a sign of friendship, Vladimir sends a large contingent of soldiers to Constantinople, and pretty much these soldiers become his own. He becomes the Belisarius's personal bodyguard. Remember the Belisarius, or I'm sorry, not Belisarius. The Belisarius, the rulers, the emperor's rulers, his personal bodyguard, much like the Praetorian Guard was that of the Roman emperors, and these are known as a Varangian Guard. These are the individuals again who Russia, or at least the Kievan rulers, supplied to the Byzantines to make up their personal bodyguard. Okay, so this is who the Varangian Guard is, the personal bodyguard who come mostly from Kievan Rus. Now, in addition, you also begin to see reorganizations of individuals. Again, you begin to see the reorganization of the Byzantine army in these regiments known as tagmata. These tagmatas are regiments or organization of units within the Byzantine military. And again, they're made up of Greek soldiers combined with, again, these Russian soldiers. Pretty much, again, just a reorganization of the military. But the one thing I want you to focus on is the position of the strategos. Now, the strategos, if you see here, are the generals who also serve as governors of these themes. Okay, so they're not only responsible for administering the land that they are assigned to, but they're also responsible for its defense as well. Now, the Byzantine Empire, throughout, since the time of Justinian, had been collectively, or at least had been consolidating power at the head, in this case, of course, the Belisarius, the emperor. And you begin to see this kind of formulation of this all-powerful individual, the emperor. And today it's defined as the position of, or at least kind of the definition that we give it, is that of Caesar papism. Now, what this means is that the Byzantine emperor is not just a political figurehead. Yes, he is incredibly powerful, but he is also technically the head of Christianity. If you remember, when Constantine, 500, 600 years earlier, had officially made Christianity had allowed for Christianity to be practiced in the religion in the Roman Empire, he organized the earliest structure of the Christian church, right? And he put himself at the head of it, and that never really went away. So every Roman Empire, every Roman emperor from Constantine on, and even at this point in time, is still technically considered the head of Christianity in Europe. And so you have this very ornate sense of power within the Byzantine emperor. And so again, the Byzantine emperor, it's important to note, is not just an individual that's on a throne. He is considered to be the utmost authority of Christianity in Europe, or anywhere, quite frankly. But needless to say, as I mentioned before, there are fractures that begin to form between the Christian churches in Europe. And a lot of this has to do with political maneuvering. The Bishop of Rome, even after the fall of the Roman Empire, was pretty much in line with the Christian church. But over the next 500, 600 years, you begin to see the Bishop of Rome becoming more and more independent, right? Becoming more and more autonomous from the Eastern Roman Church, right? And this continues to worsen over time. Now, just to give you an example of this, so something we'll discuss next week when we talk about Western Europe at this point in time during the early medieval era, is one of the things that the Bishop of Rome does, which infuriates the Byzantine emperor, is he actually names a new Roman emperor. If for those of you who are somewhat familiar with history, if you know this name, Clovis. Clovis, will just keep his name in the back of your mind because we'll talk more about him next week. But Clovis unites what is now France and becomes and converts to Latin Christianity. And so when he does this as a token of appreciation and respect, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, names Clovis Emperor of the Romans. And needless to say, this causes a lot of anger in Constantinople because, remember, technically speaking, the Byzantine emperor is the emperor of the Romans. He is the Roman emperor. He is Caesar. And so when, needless to say, when the emperor found out, he pretty much writes a letter to the Bishop of Rome and says, "What are you thinking?" And the Byzantine emperor and the Pope pulls out this document known as the Donation of Constantine and pretty much says, "This is my justification." According to this document, supposedly, when Constantine formed what is now the Christian Church, he pretty much gave permission to appoint emperors to the Bishop of Rome. All right. So again, this document, supposedly written by Constantine, pretty much gave the Bishop of Rome permission to name emperors. But here's the problem: it's a fake document. It's a fraud. It was known back then that it was a fraud, and obviously today we know it's a fraud. We don't know if the Bishop of Rome made it up himself or at the time, or did he come up across this fraudulent document and just assume that it was true? That we don't know. But nevertheless, this fraudulent document, again, no one bought, and it causes even more and more splits between the East and the West. Now, eventually, the political differences between the East and the West eventually turn pretty tense. And eventually, in 1054 CE, after many arguments and disputes and questions, you eventually have the Byzantine emperor excommunicating the Bishop of Rome. So remember, this word excommunicating basically means you're technically speaking, you cut off this individual from God. But the Bishop of Rome pretty much says, well, you can't excommunicate me because I excommunicate you. And so this is what we know as the Great Schism of 1054 CE. And you have the formation of two separate churches. The Roman Catholic Church, based in Rome, headed by the Bishop of Rome, aka the Pope, and what becomes known as the Orthodox Church, which is still technically headed by the Byzantine emperor. Now, Over the last 1,000 years, there's been significant differences in terms of faith and practicing of religion, et cetera, et cetera. Some of these things are major, some of these things are minor. Now, I will say this, the one thing I want you to remember, now there's a couple of minor things. Let me start off with that. First of all, for example, Greek Orthodox, when they do the sign of the cross themselves, they go from up, down, right, left, as opposed to Catholicism, which goes up, down, left, right. Again, very minor stuff, but apparently, yes, believe it or not, this is a major point of contention. Catholic Catholic priests and other members of the clergy are encouraged, if not required, to shave their beards, while those in the Eastern Orthodox Church do not do that. As a matter of fact, they're forbidden to shave their beards in many instances. But the thing I want you to remember, and this is kind of the most important thing about this, is the issue of the bishops. Now, what this means, though, is needless to say, the bishops, kind of who administer the various areas and parishes and bishoprics throughout Christianity, there's a difference of opinion about what the role of the bishop is between the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox churches. In the Orthodox churches, the bishops have a lot of leeway in terms of what is being taught to the laity. The word laity basically means the commoners, the churchgoers. And so the bishops in Eastern Orthodox have a lot more leeway in terms of this. Now, this is different from the Roman Catholicism, because in Roman Catholicism, the bishops always defer to the College of Cardinals, or in this case, the Pope. The College of Cardinals won't come on for a little while longer, but nonetheless, the Pope still has ultimate authority on what is being taught in the churches, in the parishes. Okay, and so this is kind of the main difference between Roman Orthodox and Roman Catholicism and Roman and Greek Orthodox, is the issue of the bishops and what their role is. Now, any questions? All right, so next thing I want to discuss is the issue of the Seljuks. Now, the best way I can describe this is what I'm about to tell you, or what I'm about to kind of describe to you, is kind of similar to if you ever had a situation where you had a relative who was, let's say you have a relative who, for whatever reason is going to stay with you for a couple of days, and this person ends up staying for a year and a half. I'm not sure if this has ever happened to you, but think of it like this. So eventually, again, Islam begins to spread throughout, needless to say, begins to spread not just throughout Dar al-Islam, but even into areas beyond their traditional borders. They begin spreading into what is now the Ganges River. They begin spreading into Central Asia, Eastern and Northern Africa. And it is here in Central Asia that you see, again, the conversions becoming more and more successful. And one of the major groups that converts is that of the Turks. The Turkic or Turkish-speaking peoples convert to Islam relatively quickly and relatively easily, and you begin to see them not just and leaving their traditional homelands along the steppes. If you remember the kind of the grasslands of this region, they begin to kind of leave their traditional homelands. And again, one of the things that Islamic missionaries, and again, whether they're missionaries that are trained or just merchants, one of the things they begin emphasizing is the brotherhood of Islam, that all of us, regardless of your language, regardless of your race, ethnicity, culture, background, we're all brothers. And so, Dar al-Islam is yours as much as it is mine. Well, many of the Turkish rulers kind of really took that to heart. And many of them just packed up their things and got on their horses and went to Dar al-Islam and make themselves comfortable, and to the point where they actually kind of take over. There's one particular, now remember, the Turkic peoples are divided by clans and like most pastoral peoples, they divide themselves into clans and other affiliations. And the most powerful of these is that of the Seljuks. The Seljuks are probably the largest and most powerful of these clans. And so the Seljuks migrate into Dar al-Islam during the Abbasid dynasty and pretty much take it over. They pretty much keep the Sultan, the Abbasid Sultan, on the throne. Now, by the way, I should probably mention at this point in time that the capital had moved from Damascus. If you remember, during the Umayyad Caliphate, the capital had been moved from Medina to Damascus, and now it is in a new city called Baghdad. So so they pretty much keep the Sultan in Baghdad, but they pretty much are the ones not calling the shots. All right, and during the Seljuk period, you have the empire expanding even further. And one of these examples is a huge battle that takes place here in central Anatolia, known as the Battle of Manzikert. Now, the Battle of Manzikert itself is a devastating defeat of the Byzantines by the Seljuks. So the Seljuks just completely wipe out the Byzantine army. And as a matter of fact, it is such a decisive victory that the Byzantine Empire will survive for the next 400 years, more or less, but it will never recover. Now, despite the Seljuk successes, all right, infighting between them and infighting between the Abbasid Caliphate eventually results in fracturing. And so while the Abbasid Caliphate still technically exists, it will never recover. And again, you have this kind of collapse between, or at least this brief period of Abbasid collapse, where you basically have the empire fracturing and fighting against each other. Now, this infighting between Muslims, right, between those who support the Seljuks and those who don't, between those who are Shia and those who are Sunni, this information gets back to Europe. And the Pope at the time, Urban II, decides to try to take advantage of the situation by launching a crusade. Now, the whole purpose of this crusade was to pretty much liberate the Holy Land, particularly the city of Jerusalem, from the Muslims. Now, many of the European kingdoms at the time begin to gather armies. Now, while Europe is preparing their militaries, an individual named Peter the Hermit decides to lead his own crusade just based on people. So he invites anyone, men, women, children, to come with him and march on the homeland. His argument was that we don't need military training. We don't need anything like that, because we are protected by God. This is a crusade that is blessed by the Lord. So what else do we need? So Peter leads as many as 50,000 people from what is now Germany into the homeland. Now, it is here, as they begin marching along the Rhine River. Now, this river here, if you see here pointed on this map, this Rhine River is located here. Now, as they're forming, as they cross along, the Rhine at the time is home to several Jewish communities who have become large and have kind of become prosperous on their own. As Peter's crusade marches through the Rhineland, the sense of religious zealotry, this religious of zealous fervor of non-Christians eventually results in massacres, where you have Peter's crusade slaughtering tens of thousands of Jews during this march through the land onto the Holy Land. Now, eventually, you have Peter's crusade arriving in Dar al-Islam, only to be completely overwhelmed by a Seljuk army. And the majority of the people who survived this one particular battle, and remember, keep in mind that most of them didn't have any weapons. They just came because Peter promised them that they were going to be okay. And most of this crusade, 50,000 more or less, eventually were all arrested and eventually enslaved. So most of them just kind of disappeared into the various parts of Dar al-Islam, becoming slaves. Correct. They marched from Germany into Dar al-Islam, where eventually they are captured and the majority of them enslaved. Now, eventually the actual professional militaries of Europe begin, finally organize and eventually march into the Holy Land. And they actually do very well. In 1099 CE, they capture the city of Jerusalem in a very violent battle, which they basically massacre the entire population of Jerusalem at this point in time. And they establish in this region, in the area known as the Levant. If you remember, the term Levant is used to kind of describe what is now today the Sinai, Egypt, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, this region here. They established several puppet kingdoms. Now, these kingdoms last for about at least another century, but eventually you begin to see now how the Muslim world reacted to the loss of Jerusalem is still very much up for debate. There's some historians who make the argument that they panicked. There's other historians who kind of made the argument that they just kind of, whatever. But there is no doubt that the Muslim world kind of looked at each other and said, "What are we doing? We're so busy fighting each other that we let Jerusalem fall into the hands of the Christians." And so this is where you begin to see them kind of realizing that they're bigger fish to fry than just our petty squabbles. And so you begin to see various attacks, or at least attempts to recapture the Holy Land, and the most successful of them is that of Saladin. Now, Saladin is what we call a Mamluk. Now, I'm not sure if I've talked about the Mamluks before, but I will now. Mamluks are slave/soldiers. These are individuals who have been enslaved. They're trained as military soldiers, and they are, again, professional soldiers. And this makes up the majority of the Abbasid military, right? Where these slave soldiers kind of, again, serve the will of on paper at least, serve the will of the Caliph, and Saladin is one of them. And again, he eventually is responsible for the reconquest of Jerusalem and the destruction of many, not all, many of these Christian kingdoms that had been established here in this particular region. Now, there are 8 total crusades. I'm not going to go over any of them, with the exception of one, the 4th Crusade. Again, another crusade was called, and you have a Christian army arriving at Constantinople. Now, by this point in time, the Byzantine Empire had enough of the Crusaders, because they were not, the Crusaders were pretty much wrecking everything they could find every time they passed through. They would just leave a mess. They would steal things. They would rape. They would kill. And so the Byzantine Empire decides, yeah, that's enough. We're not going to let you pass. Remember, Constantinople is kind of on this, you kind of have to cross through Constantinople in order to get to the other side of Anatolia. So you have to go through here to jump over through here. And so the Byzantine soldiers, the Crusaders decide, well, if we can't get to the Holy Land, let's just burn down the city. And so they did. They eventually attacked the city itself and more or less destroyed it. All right. So again, another setback in this history of the Byzantine Empire, right? The sack of Constantinople. Now, again, like I said before, you really don't have the Crusades really being successful, with the exception of the first one. Now, eventually, as the Abbasid Empire begins to die, and again, the Abbasids never really had control over Dar al-Islam. Most people recognize the position of the Caliph, but the Caliph didn't really have a lot of political power outside of what is now Iraq. And so you begin to see various kingdoms break off on their own during this period in time. And so it is during this period in time that you begin to see the Mamluks, many of the Mamluk regiments declare themselves independent, because again, no one really wants to be a slave. And so one of these examples is in Egypt, where a Mamluk army establishes their own kingdom here in Egypt. And again, they are relatively successful for many, many years. As a matter of fact, when the Mongols storm into Dar al-Islam, they will eventually destroy the Abbasid Caliphate. It is the Mongols who will wipe out the Abbasid Caliphate. and we'll hopefully get a chance to talk about them before the semester ends. But the Mamluks are one of the few peoples, one of the few states that actually are able to resist Mongol invasion. Right, they're actually able to successfully defend themselves against the Mongols. Actually, the first time that the Mongols have been defeated in a major battle like this. And so again, this area, needless to say, is incredibly confusing. All right, especially with the collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate, you have different warring states kind of developing. And keep in mind, however, that the Caliph is still a thing. Well, up until the last Caliph is killed by the Mongols. Now, I'm just going to kind of go over this stuff very, very briefly again, because I know I'm running out of time. But what I want to focus on here is the issue of what we call gender relations. Now, what this means, or what I'm trying to get at here, is the issue of gender relations when it comes to Islam. Now, needless to say, obviously there is a lot of concern, or at least a lot of controversy regarding issues of gender in Islam. For example, people obviously hear about the status of women in places like in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, in places like Saudi Arabia, where women are not allowed to drive. So, needless to say, it's a very controversial issue. Now, I'll just say this: in the Quran, in the actual text of Islam, women are actually given relatively large amounts of rights. Certain rights aren't even granted to women in either the Old Testament or the New Testament. For example, women are granted rights to own property, rights to sell businesses, rights to conduct business. They're granted rights of divorce in case a husband is abusive, or a husband cannot perform his marital duties. Let's call it that. And so you do have women becoming more and more, they do have rights, and they do have a certain kind of concepts. Now, I will say this is that there are strong pushes against this, where you do have individuals kind of resisting kind of women kind of becoming more and more liberated. For example, one of the rulers around one of the Islamic rulers here around the local regions during the Crusade, a man named Usama bin Mutbi, was actually shocked when he saw the behavior of women in the Crusader kingdoms. In other words, he had interactions with the Crusader kingdoms. You remember those kingdoms that were created by the Crusaders after their victory of Jerusalem? He was shocked that husbands allowed their wives to walk around alone in public and shake hands and converse with men who they were not married. So needless to say, while the Quran does offer women more rights, there is a sense of patriarchy within that. Now, this is one of the questions I often get about Islam, about what does the Quran say about women being veiled, and they have burqas where they're completely covered. Truth be told, the Quran says nothing about that. In other words, there's no reference to women being covered from head to toe or anything else like that. All it says is that women have to dress modestly and have to wear at least a veil when they go out. Now, again, remember, this is an Eastern Mediterranean thing. It is not an Islamic thing. Now, what I mean by this is that in Athens, in classical Athens that we were talking about earlier, women, especially those of wealthy status, are not allowed to leave their houses. And when they do, they have to be veiled and have to be accompanied by a male guardian. Mind you, this is in Athens, during the time of Sparta and Athens, et cetera, et cetera. So this patriarchal oppression of women is a Mediterranean thing, right? It just basically becomes entered into the religion. So, nevertheless, you do have more and more attempts to kind of suppress or oppress women in these very, very structured gender roles. Now, the theme system that worked out so well for the Byzantine Empire eventually begins to collapse for a couple of different reasons. The first part is that the generals eventually stop enforcing land redistribution. Remember, the whole key, the whole kind of the whole engine of this is that the generals have to pretty much ensure that land is being redistributed. But as time progresses, it is the generals who become wealthy landowners themselves. They begin accumulating wealth enough so that they begin owning land, and so all of a sudden they're not interested in redistributing their own land. And so without this, you begin to see the collapse of the theme system, right? Where all of a sudden greedy generals refuse to kind of announce or allow for individuals. So again, like I said before, you begin to see this process of re-centralization, where in other words, power concentrates on the emperor, on the central government in Constantinople, as opposed to the local regions. And so again, you begin to see expansion of the bureaucracy. You begin to see this reorganization of land, or at least taxation, known as a pronia. Now the pronoia, the pronoia was essentially a form of taxation, right? Where essentially you could pretty much just pay in order to be exempt from military service. All right, so needless to say, all of these things, yes, while the empire collects revenue, at the same time, remember, military service is one of those things that is absolutely needed. All right, but nevertheless, this becomes more and more problematic. Now, let me ask a question, and I think I might have asked this before, but I'm just, when we were meeting face to face, but let me ask this one more time. During this period of time, as you can see by the map, you begin to see emphasis on, I guess, what you would call food and spices. All of a sudden, black pepper, cayenne, you begin to see paprika, you begin to see all these different spices that we all know today that you can buy at the grocery store, in bulk. Also, cinnamon becoming more and more popular. But why? Why are spices, so sought after? No, okay, very good. That's really the reason why. I mean, yes, Jonathan, there are medicinal purposes, there are food preservation, but at the end of the day, people like to taste their food. I mean, if you've ever eaten traditional European cuisine without spices, it's gross. Like traditional Italian food before the inclusion of the tomato, it's gross. Like it's not good. Does anyone ever heard of this particular food? Haggis? Do you know what haggis is? So you're right. It's so what it is. It's they take the stomach of the sheep and they stuff it with the intestines, and then they boil it in salt water. So it's like eating. For those of you familiar with tripitas, it's like that, only gross. Mm. So needless to say, this is why you begin to see this massive trade network developing. Now, needless to say, spices are just an example, or just one part of this. All right, but again, spices are a part of it, nonetheless. And so again, you do not. Yes, it's very disgusting. So you begin to see again this trade network forming, and again, this is the Silk Road. Remember, I told you that there is no actual road; it is just a series of networks and trading routes that connect. This is the Silk Road, and this is what it is. Silk, fruits, vegetables, et cetera. This is where all of this originates and comes from. All right, and again, it's not just between Europe and Asia. You see Africa involved in this as well, especially in the form of North African gold and slaves. So, with this rise of commercialization and the rise of these consistent trading networks, there also comes issues with sanitation, like we see today. Remember, it kind of coincidentally, here in southern China, the origin of what we now call the Black Death, and I'm sure all of you have heard of it before, and quite frankly, some of you are even writing research papers about it, which is great. The origin of the Black Death, what we call the Black Death itself, is actually from here, somewhere in southern China. This is where we believe it originated from. Now, eventually, Chinese merchants will inadvertently carry this disease into Central Asia will be picked up by European merchants here in, actually the Mongols will take it with them here into what is now southern Russia, and eventually Italian merchants will then take it here into Italy. So it started in southern China. Yeah. So that's what we believe in. And even then, it killed, as as much as it had an effect on Europe, where 25% of the population dies. We believe that as many as 80 million Chinese died because of this disease at this particular period of time. And so, yeah, it's very as I mentioned before, as Mark Twain used to say, history doesn't necessarily repeat as much as it rhymes. So nonetheless, so again, you do have these negatives of this. Well, yes, it does increase the amount of what we call luxury items. You do have this. Now, keep in mind, one of the interesting things about this, and we'll talk more about this next week, is something I forgot to mention that I do have a few minutes. So one of the areas that you see here that Dar al-Islam expands to is in Spain. Now, in 711 CE, a Muslim army marches or crosses the Mediterranean and invades southern what is now southern Spain. Now, at the time, southern Spain, or at least Spain in general, is under the control of the Visigoths. Now, the Visigoths are Germanic peoples who, yes, it killed quite so many. Now, the Visigoths are one of these Germanic tribes that invades the Roman Empire. Now, the Visigothic influence on modern day Spain is not very prevalent. Just the one example I'll give you is the one thing that the Visigoths left behind in Spain is, for those of you whose last name ends with either an ES or an EZ. All right, think of it like if you hear people who come from Northern Europe, particularly, like they have last names like Stevenson, Johnson, Erickson, things like that. EZ and ES in Spanish is the same thing. So, for example, my last name is Gonzalez, which literally translates into the Germanic of son of Gonzalo. Hernandez. So that's one of the more interesting, kind of one of the few legacies that's behind by the Germanic invaders during the 300 years that they ruled Spain. Now, again, as I mentioned before, in 711 CE, again, a Muslim army invades and nearly completely overwhelms the Visigoths, and they conquer about 90% of the kingdom, with the exception of a few regions here in northern Spain. And for the next 700 years, there was a Muslim influence in Spain. Now, the longest lasting legacy behind this is the issue of the language. All right, Spain is heavily influenced by Arabic and other Muslim-speaking languages, particularly Arabic. All right, pretty much every word in Spanish that starts with an al, alfombra, almohada, algodón, even things like azúcar. All of these things are Arabic words. Even this word that I hear constantly and I use every once in a while, ojalá, ojalá, oh Allah, God willing. So you have a very, very strong influence, at least in the language, by these Muslim kingdoms who are established until 1492. But we'll talk more about them later on. So with that in mind, since I'm running out of time, again, I just want to remind you, let me see here. I just want to remind you all before we close out that your exam is next Tuesday. We won't have class that day. You will have all day to complete it, but just please remember there is a time limit. So please make sure that you have that in mind as you complete the exam. Other than that, I don't have anything else. I will post up the lecture. I know I haven't posted up the lecture from Tuesday. I will post up both today, if not tomorrow. All right. So is there anything else you need to cover? The study guide is posted online, so please make sure you take a look at that before you continue. Is there anything else that we need to go over before we continue, or before we end, I should say?